So here's a question for you. Are we accountable to a God that we don't believe in? Mike Winger seems to think so. And in my continuing effort to find any theist at all who isn't low hanging fruit, I take on someone suggested as a high point in Christianity. Will I change my mind, or will it just be confirmed once again that these people are not at all impressive? Watch on, and let's find out. So, a while back, I talked about a bunch of supposedly good apologists and theologians. I mentioned this in a video in passing, and Mike Winger was on the list, and conveniently, Mike Winger has a YouTube channel. Therefore, I decided to take a look, and let's be honest, the vast majority of his output is very, very long form, and thus it's really not amenable to doing any kind of a video response to. So I found one that I could actually go after, and here it is. It might not be the best way to go about it, but it's really the only way we have. Now, I've done a lot of reading and watching of his other videos, and this guy doesn't impress me either, but we're going to go into some detail on why that is. Because none of these people actually impress the skeptics. Because these people, they're not making material for us. They're only making material for the gullibly religious.
What happens to the people who have never heard of the gospel?
Yes, I actually struggled with this one myself for a while. I did a teaching on it a few years back, and so I'll put a link to the video down below for the full teaching on this. I actually surveyed through scriptures to try to support each point where I talk about it, so I'll just summarize a few things.
And there it is right there. Because when the religious start talking about God, the first thing they do is that they assume that God is real. They don't try to demonstrate it. They don't try to prove it. They just assume it. There's always that implicit assertion that, well, of course God is real, that can never be adequately justified to those who don't already believe. And this is just story time for the emotionally gullible. As I said, I watched some of his other videos where he did pretty much the same thing, where he just assumed that his beliefs were true without ever taking the time to demonstrate that they actually were. Now, I know that he's done some debates, and at least as I write this, I haven't had time to watch them because, well, they're long and I just don't have the time. But he even says that he rarely ever debates because, according to a tweet, it's not gifting or the focus of his ministry. And that's the problem that I have here with pretty much all theologians and apologists. They're not seeking demonstrable truth. They're just passing on a message that they happen to like. And I don't respect that. I just don't. I want to know the truth, no matter what it is. I don't have an agenda. I want to follow the evidence that we have to the best conclusion that we can draw from it, and the religious don't seem remotely interested in that. If there is a God, I want to know that. If there are no gods, I want to know that too. I just don't see anyone on the religious side doing the same thing. And that's kind of a problem.
Here's principles to have in mind. Nobody's condemned because they're ignorant of the gospel. Like they've never heard the name of Jesus, now they're condemned. That never happens. That's not a biblical idea. They're only judged for what they do know. God judges us based on what we do know. Jesus even talks about this, that being judged according to our knowledge. The judgment for his generation was greater because they had seen him and experienced his miracles, so it was a bigger deal.
Now, this part I could almost go along with, leaving all of the unjustified God stuff aside, but in a second, he's going to say something that is just ludicrous, an artifact of a specific brand of evangelical Christian belief that doesn't actually work in the real world. Because, like most theists, I don't think Mike Winger actually lives in the real world, at least not when it comes to his religious beliefs. He doesn't have to independently justify any of this beyond his God-colored glasses, because that's automatically right, even if it's completely unjustified and completely unsupported. This is where I see so many discussions and debates go completely south, because the theist, They are convinced for bad, irrational reasons that their core beliefs must be true, and that's not even up for discussion. Now, I can't directly criticize Mike Winger here because, as I said, I haven't seen his debates yet, and I don't know when I'll find the time. But in tons of other debates that I have seen, the theist gets to assume that they are right without ever being held to task for proving that they are. Well, it says so in the Bible. Well, who cares about that until you can demonstrate that the Bible has anything remotely resembling objective fact within it? Because that's all I care about, and these people simply don't. It makes them happy, and for them, that's all that matters. Except, as we all know, it isn't.
But they do know stuff. Everybody does know stuff. So they know that God exists. They know that sin is real and they've sinned against God. Okay, this is stuff everyone knows. I say know loosely here because it's stuff everybody is accountable for knowing. That's the real term I should use here.
And there you go. Because he's just asserting that everybody magically knows that God is real and everybody knows that they're a miserable sinner. Well, says who? Your silly book? I don't care about your book. I care what you can prove objectively and demonstrably. Because I certainly don't know that God is real. God, based on every shred of evidence that we have, seems to be a figment of the overly emotional religious mind. I have no reason at all to think that there are any gods whatsoever, and you have no right whatsoever to insist that I do. See, normally I don't watch the videos before I respond to them. I think it keeps them fresh. However, in this case, I did watch up to this point because I was trying to figure out if there were any Mike Winger videos worth doing, and it was at this point that I decided that I wanted to do this video because it was at this point that Mike Winger proved that he wasn't concerned with reality, just his own religious delusions. This is exactly why so many discussions fall apart, because the religious really want to believe the version of reality that they see in their holy books, not the version of reality that is actually defensible in the real world. But it says so in my book. But that isn't a reasonable defense, and the second that I see that, I know I'm not dealing with anyone who has a full grasp on their rational senses. I don't care what you believe. I care what you can demonstrate is actually true in the real world that we all share. And the second someone starts to tell me what I've got going on in my head, that somehow they know my innermost thoughts better than I do because it says so in a ridiculous book of mythology, that conversation is pretty much over, because that is just dumb. Your faith doesn't get you anywhere. Your faith is idiotic. But let's continue anyhow, because from here on out, this is new territory for me.
Like, creation makes it obvious to us, but I can choose to reject that knowledge of God. And so I may not retain it. I may not currently be like, I don't think like atheists, like they really know God exists. Like they're just lying when they say they're atheists. Like I'm not saying that. But there's accountability. They should know God exists. And then how they respond to this knowledge is something that they are going to be judged for when they stand before God.
Except you're just rationalizing your way to your religion. You're not actually asking atheists if they really do know any of these things. He's just making excuses for why the things in his book must be true without trying to verify any of it independently. It's honestly not that hard. Just go and ask atheists if they really know that God is real. I'll go first. The answer is no. And I'm only held accountable for things that I actually know, not the ridiculous assertions written down by primitive goat herders, because then I'm not accountable to any of it at all. I mean, besides the fact that there's no good reason at all to think that any God of any kind exists in the first place. You'd have to provide evidence for that, and you don't have any. You can't be accountable to an imaginary friend. They can't accept that, of course, which is why decent discussions rarely happen between the religious and the non-religious on this subject. They insist that God has to be real, based on blind faith, and they are completely incapable of really delving into that concept intellectually. Because none of this has anything at all to do with intelligence. It's pure emotions on a bun.
So I also know God wants people to be saved, and people can respond to general revelation. And I also know that biblically, God responds to people who are seeking him.
And how exactly do you know any of that? Not believe, not have faith. How do you know? What's your epistemological system by which you can show how you came to this supposed knowledge? Yeah, that doesn't exist, does it? It's a lot easier to just claim knowledge than it is to actually demonstrate knowledge, and the religious are piss poor at doing the latter. So no, I don't accept that you actually know any of the things that you claim to know, any more than you know that everybody else believes in your imaginary friend, and we're all just blocking it from our minds. That's an excuse meant to get back to your emotionally comforting conclusion, not a demonstrable path to objectively verifiable truth. The first is nothing to be proud of. The second is what we should all be striving to achieve. And you people don't care.
So if someone reaches out to God like, I know there's a God, I know I've got sin issues, like help, and they don't know anything about Jesus, I think there's a chance God reveals more to them, and then they actually end up being saved. And we have Old Testament examples of this, like guys like Naaman in 1 Kings 5. He comes to Israel, he does not become a Jew, but he sees that the God of Israel is true, and so he rejects all the pagan gods and decides he's going to only worship Yahweh, but he's not even becoming Jewish. He's not part of the covenant. But it seems as though he's saved. And there's other examples of this, where they have, I'll use the term, they have partial faith or partial knowledge. Right? They have actual faith, but it's faith with partial knowledge. Like they know the true God and they're trusting in him for grace, but they don't know all the details about Jesus.
Which, of course, wouldn't have been possible in the time before Jesus supposedly lived. This is really where Christians have to dance a jig to get around the fact that if Jesus is actually necessary for salvation, how the hell did people who lived before Jesus actually manage it? Acts 16, 30 through 31 is very clear in this regard. If you don't believe in Jesus, then you're not saved. Of course, that leaves everybody in the Old Testament going to hell because there was no Jesus to believe in. So they have to come up with a way around that because they don't like the idea of their Old Testament Bible heroes going to hell, so they have to invent an exception out of whole cloth. You do need Jesus to be saved, but yeah, because God is unchanging except where he does. And if you read the Bible, he changes a lot. And that's kind of convenient, isn't it?
And I get into this in more detail in my longer study. But basically, when Jesus shows up, he reveals that how people responded to the things already revealed is how they'll respond when they get more information about Jesus. In John, he's like, hey, if you believe Moses, you would have believed me. If you believe the revelation you already given, you would have believed me. So those people like Naaman, who didn't know about Jesus, when they encounter Christ later, they're already trusting in him. They just didn't know his name. They didn't know the details. And so Jesus is the only way to salvation.
Even when he's not. And this is where I have to keep pointing out the difference between rationality and rationalization because I don't think some people understand. So let's take a moment to explain. Rationality is the quality of being based in reason or logic. It's not caring where you go, it's caring how you get there. Rationalization, though, that's the complete opposite. It only cares about the destination. It doesn't care if it's the best evidenced, best supported, most rational answer to any given question. It only wants to get there because that provides the most emotional comfort, and the emotional comfort is all the believer wants. And that's why the definition of rationalization is the action of attempting to explain or justify behavior or an attitude with logical reasons, even if these are not appropriate. It's trying to fast talk your way to where you want to go. It's cherry picking the data, selecting only those pieces that get you where you want to be, and then ignoring all the parts that don't. And this is what the religious do. It's all they do. It's all they can do because rationality doesn't get them where they want to go. And they're too emotionally invested to risk winding up anywhere else. I'm not seeing Mike Winger be any different, at least not in this video. I can't speak for anything else. This is not something that he should be proud of.
But for those who've never heard, they're only judged based on their response to what they did hear. And there's a chance that, yeah, there's a chance they'd be saved. Sadly, it seems like humans generally don't take that route, right? They tend to not turn to the God that is revealed in creation.
Because no gods demonstrably are. Now, you might be convinced that they are. You're just wrong. You have no evidence of any kind that you can present outside of your own wishful thinking and your own fifis. You can't provide a demonstrable, rational through line from the physical evidence that we have to the imaginary friend in your head. And of course, this is why all the religious philosophical arguments fall apart, because they are all lacking that component. You can't just define anything into existence. You have to be able to show that it's actually real in the real world, and the religious simply can't do that. Nor do they even make a good faith effort. The only thing he's working on here is blind faith, and blind faith isn't impressive, at least not to anybody who's remotely skeptical. It might be impressive to the people who really wish it was true, but that doesn't make it true. If he had anything else, and like I said, I can only speak for what I've seen so far, and I haven't seen a lot, but it's a bit telling when he's talking to his own side, as he is in all of the videos I've seen, he's only pushing the faith end of it because he knows that's what sells. It's really scamming your audience 101. That's kind of a problem from where I'm sitting, and I don't understand why the religious can't get that through their heads.
And I would say there's a nuance here that I'd like to add for just to make sure that my point I'm not getting misunderstood is that saying that there's a way for people to be saved if they haven't heard Jesus, to be careful here and say it's Jesus, he's the way. Can you access Jesus by responding to partial revelation properly? And the answer I would say is yes, you can, but that doesn't mean it's an automatic pass. I never heard the gospel, I'm saved. That's not the answer I'm giving actually at all. I'm saying there's a potential, but it seems that people generally speaking end up projecting. And when the light of the gospel goes out, that's more light, that's more knowledge, and it's more opportunity for them to receive. So it does increase the number of people who end up being saved.
And what about, say, the Paraha, who to this day still have no God concept even after they've been introduced to the idea? They think the idea of gods is silly. It's stupid. It makes no sense at all. Can they be saved? Well, of course, that assumes that there's any such thing as gods to begin with, something that people like Mike can't demonstrate. If there aren't actually gods, then the idea of salvation is a complete waste of time. Salvation by what? Salvation from what? Without gods, there is no sin because there's nothing to sin against. There's nothing that you need to be saved from. Therefore, the whole idea is moot until someone can demonstrate the underlying assumptions, and surprise, surprise, nobody can actually do that. And they don't try because they don't care. How sad is that?
Yeah.
And that people worshiping false gods is evidence that they've rejected the revelation of God. So that's a condemning thing, yeah.
And I don't worship any gods. Not that it matters, because I don't think any gods are real based on the evidence that we have at hand. The whole thing is just religious masturbation. A bunch of people with ridiculous ideas in their heads telling each other stories for mutual emotional comfort. It's just stupid. It really is. I figured the religious would recognize this if, say, they were looking at something like Scientology or some nature religion, but they just can't figure out that they're all doing the same thing as the clearly delusional are. They're all delusional. They just can't see it in themselves because they desperately want their delusions to be true. It's really hard to express just how pathetic all of this is. But it is.
So this is where I get into I'm a bit twisted at times. I want these kind of things to bother people. You know, I want these kind of questions to just really eat at people and realize that this is, again, I said it before, life and death. This is important stuff we're talking about dealing with here. And if you're bothered by this question, if you're not sure what you've heard about Jesus and you need to, it's eating at you, good. It's time to figure that out. Find somebody you can talk to about this and get to the bottom of it. It's important stuff.
Yeah, but the only thing I'm concerned about is how absolutely idiotic the three of you look, sitting around and telling nonsensical stories supported by nothing but your own wishful thinking. This is what happens when you spend all of your time in your own insular echo chamber, talking to people who think exactly like you do, without considering the larger ramifications or the real world beyond your door, without caring if any of it is true at all. So where does that actually get any of us? It makes the theist money because they have a ready-made audience willing to throw money at them for emotional comfort, and the rest of us just roll our eyes into the back of our heads because none of it gets them anywhere rational, intelligent, or evidence-based. I really don't get it. And I used to be like that, and I don't get it at all anymore. It just doesn't make any sense. Just based on the small sample size that I've seen of Mike Winger. It might impress the already faithful, but it sure doesn't impress me one bit. So I guess the question has to be asked. What would impress me, since I'm so utterly unimpressed with the religious the vast majority of the time? Well, that's fair. It's a good question. I'd be impressed if there was a theist, anyone, anywhere, that could produce evidence for the things that they believe and who could rationally justify what they believed in some objective, intellectual, non-faith-based way. As I've said many times, I don't care what you believe. I care what you can prove, and these people don't seem capable of proving a damn thing. It's all faith and fifis, and if that's the best that you've got, then I am not going to be impressed with you. And unfortunately, it seems that for Mike Winger, he's going to fail the rationality test, just like all of the others do. So long as this is about emotion over evidence, you've got nothing at all to be proud of. Maybe some of you ought to try to do better. Unfortunately, I figure that the ones that try, they don't stay religious for long, because religion, by all the evidence that we have, is complete and total bunk. It's the ones who actually care if the things in their heads are real. Those are the ones who are increasingly just walking away from religion. It's why religion is dying in the Western world. And I find that a very, very good thing.
Bum